The morning of December 7, 1941, dawned crystal clear over Oahu, with gentle trade winds carrying the scent of plumeria across the island. A paradise that would transform into an inferno within hours, as 353 Japanese aircraft screamed out of the northern sky at 7:48 a.m., unleashing a torrent of bombs and torpedoes that would sink or damage 18 ships, destroy nearly 200 aircraft, kill 2,403 Americans, wound 1,178 more, and drag a reluctant nation kicking and screaming into the deadliest conflict in human history, all before most Americans had finished their Sunday breakfast. ***. The Hawaiian sun rose at 6:26 a.m. that Sunday morning, painting the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson. For the 96,000 military personnel stationed across Oahu, it promised to be an ordinary weekend day: church services, baseball games, liberty in Honolulu, letters home. The war raging across Europe and Asia seemed impossibly distant from this tropical paradise, despite the mounting tensions between the United States and Imperial Japan. Aboard the USS Arizona, moored along Battleship Row in Pearl Harbor, Seaman First Class James Corey woke early for his watch duty. The 608-foot battleship, home to 1,512 crew members, rocked gently in the calm harbor waters. Around him, 7 other battleships formed an imposing line: Nevada, Oklahoma, Tennessee, West Virginia, Maryland, California, and Pennsylvania. It was the heart of America's Pacific Fleet, and it projected power and confidence. At the Opana Point radar station on Oahu's northern tip, Private Joseph Lockard and Private George Elliott had been on duty since 4 a.m., operating one of the Army's new mobile radar units. At 7:02 a.m., they detected something unusual: a large formation of aircraft approaching from the north, 137 miles out. Lockard, more experienced with the equipment, watched as the blip grew larger and more distinct. They immediately called the information center at Fort Shafter. The call was answered by Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, an inexperienced officer who was only on his second day of duty. When told about the large formation, Tyler made a fateful decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He knew that a group of B-17 bombers was expected to arrive from California that morning, and he assumed the radar contact was picking them up. "Don't worry about it," he told Lockard. The 2 privates shut down their equipment at 7:45 a.m. as scheduled and headed for breakfast. 3 minutes later, the first wave of Japanese aircraft, 183 fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes, reached Oahu's northern coast. In the hills above Pearl Harbor, Commander Mitsuo Fukuda led the aerial armada, having traveled 230 miles from 6 Japanese aircraft carriers positioned north of the island. As the lush green mountains of Oahu came into view, Fukuda radioed back to the fleet: "Tora! Tora! Tora! Tiger! Tiger! Tiger!" the code confirming that complete tactical surprise had been achieved. At precisely 7:48 a.m., the first Japanese torpedo bombers screamed over the waters of Pearl Harbor, releasing their deadly payloads at the unsuspecting American fleet. The sound was unlike anything the sailors had heard: a high-pitched whine followed by massive explosions that sent geysers of water and flame hundreds of feet into the air. Aboard the USS Arizona, Seaman Corey was climbing down from his watch position when the world exploded. A Japanese Kate torpedo bomber, piloted by Lieutenant Commander Kikichi Takahashi, had singled out the Arizona as a primary target. The first torpedo struck the ship's starboard side near the bow, creating a massive hole and flooding the forward magazines. Sailors scrambled to their battle stations, many still in their pajamas or underwear, as alarm bells clanged desperately throughout the ship. On the Battleship Row, chaos erupted. The USS Oklahoma, moored outboard of the Maryland, took 3 torpedo hits within the first 5 minutes. The 583-foot vessel began listing, immediately to port. Below decks, hundreds of sailors found themselves trapped in compartments that were rapidly filling with water and fuel oil. 18-year-old seaman Stephen Bauer Young watched in horror as the deck began tilting beneath his feet. "She's going over!" someone screamed, and within 12 minutes of the first hit, the Oklahoma had capsized completely, her hull pointing toward the sky, trapping over 400 men inside her steel tomb. The USS California, flagship of the Pacific Fleet's battle force, took 2 torpedoes almost immediately. Counterflooding efforts began, but communication systems had been damaged. Young Ensign Edgar M. Fane rushed through flooding compartments, trying to coordinate damage control, but the ship was already settling into the harbor mud. At 8:06 a.m., just 18 minutes into the attack, the USS Arizona met her apocalyptic fate. A 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb, converted from a battleship shell and dropped by a Aichi D-3A1 Val dive bomber at 10,000 feet, penetrated the Arizona's forward deck and detonated in or near the ship's forward ammunition magazine. The explosion was cataclysmic, powerful enough to lift the 32,000-ton battleship out of the water. The blast measured on seismographs across Oahu. A fireball over 600 feet tall erupted from the ship, raining burning oil and metal fragments across the harbor. Seaman Corey, who had been racing toward his battle station, was thrown through the air by the concussion. He landed in the water, his clothes on fire, his ears ringing so badly he couldn't hear his own screams. Around him, the harbor had transformed into an inferno. Burning oil spread across the water's surface, trapping swimmers in walls of flame. Men dove deep, trying to swim beneath the fire, their lungs burning, only to surface into more flames when they desperately needed air. The Arizona sank in 9 minutes, taking 1,177 men with her, nearly half of the total American deaths that day. Among the dead was Rear Admiral Isaac C. Kidd and the ship's captain, Franklin Van Valkenburg, both killed on the bridge by the massive explosion. Brothers, fathers, sons, entire families back on the mainland would be devastated by news from this single ship. On Ford Island, in the middle of the harbor, aviation ordnance man John William Finn was at the Naval Air Station Kaneohe Bay when the attack began. Despite being hit by 20 shrapnel wounds, Finn manned a machine gun in a completely exposed position for over 2 hours, shooting at the Japanese aircraft with a weapon designed to be fired from a mounted position, not handheld. He would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions, the first awarded for actions during World War II. The USS West Virginia took at least 7 torpedo hits. Her captain, Mervyn Benyon, was struck by flying shrapnel as he stood on the bridge. Mortally wounded, he refused to leave his post, continuing to give orders even as his life ebbed away. Mess attendant Doris Miller, an African-American sailor who had been collecting laundry when the attack began, rushed to the bridge. Despite having no training on the weapons, Miller manned a .50 caliber anti-aircraft gun and fired at Japanese planes until he ran out of ammunition, then helped carry the dying captain to a safer location. Miller would become one of the first African-American recipients of the Navy Cross. By 8:25 a.m., Battleship Row was an apocalyptic scene. The Arizona was a smoking wreck, flames still consuming her superstructure. The Oklahoma lay capsized, her barnacle-covered hull visible above the waterline. Desperate banging sounds coming from inside as trapped sailors used wrenches and hammers to signal they were still alive. The West Virginia had settled into the mud but remained upright. The California was sinking slowly. The Tennessee and Maryland, moored inboard and partially protected by their sister ships, had sustained damage but remained operational. The Nevada, at the northern end of Battleship Row, had managed to get underway, the only battleship to do so during the attack. The first wave of attacks had lasted 45 minutes. In that time, the Japanese had achieved devastating success, but their work wasn't finished. At 8:40 a.m., a second wave of 167 aircraft arrived over Oahu. This wave consisted primarily of high-level bombers and dive bombers, targeting the ships that had survived the first assault and focusing on shore installations, hangars, and airfields. The USS Nevada, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Francis Thomas, had become a symbol of defiance. Steam had been up on her boilers for a planned departure the next day, allowing her to get underway despite having taken a torpedo hit. As she moved slowly down the channel toward the open sea, she became the focus of intense Japanese attention. Wave after wave of dive bombers screamed down at the moving battleship, their bombs creating massive waterspouts around her and striking her deck repeatedly. Harbor Control, watching in horror, realized that if the Nevada sank in the narrow channel, she would block the harbor entrance, trapping the entire fleet. Using signal flags and radio, they ordered the Nevada to beach herself. At 9:10 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Thomas deliberately ran his ship aground at Hospital Point. Despite taking significant damage and being on fire in multiple locations, the Nevada had denied the Japanese one of their key objectives. At Hickam Field, adjacent to Pearl Harbor, the scene was equally catastrophic. Rows of aircraft had been parked wingtip to wingtip, a defensive measure against potential sabotage that made them perfect targets for aerial attack. Japanese bombers and fighters swept across the airfield, dropping bombs and strafing with machine guns. Aircraft exploded, sending shrapnel flying. Hangars collapsed. Barracks were hit, killing men in their beds. Private Robert Markowitz was in the mess hall when the attack began. He ran outside and saw a Japanese Zero fighter coming directly at him, so low he could see the pilot's face. The fighter's machine guns stitched a line of bullets across the ground, hitting Markowitz in the leg. As he lay bleeding, he watched the plane pull up, the pilot looking back at him. Markowitz survived, but dozens of his fellow airmen did not. By the end of the attack, Hickam Field had lost 189 men killed, more than any other Army installation. At the Naval Air Station on Ford Island, Chief Aviation Ordnanceman John Finn continued his heroic stand. Wounded multiple times, bleeding profusely, he kept his machine gun firing at every Japanese plane that came within range. Around him, other sailors fought desperately to save their aircraft and their lives. The base commander, Captain James Shoemaker, raced from position to position, directing firefighting efforts and organizing what defenses could be mounted. Wheeler Field, the Army Air Force's main fighter base in the center of Oahu, was hit hard in both waves. Of the 140 aircraft stationed there, only 43 survived the attack. Second Lieutenant George Welch and Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor, who had been at an all-night poker game, managed to race to Haleiwa Auxiliary Airfield, where a few P-40 fighters had been dispersed. They took off during the attack, shot down several Japanese aircraft, landed to rearm and refuel, and went up again, the only American pilots to engage in sustained aerial combat during the raid. In downtown Honolulu, civilian casualties mounted. Anti-aircraft shells fired at Japanese planes but which failed to detonate fell back to earth, exploding in residential neighborhoods. Mrs. Janet Yumiko Oda was killed in her home when a shell crashed through her roof. 3-year-old Nancy Masako Arakaki died when shrapnel hit her home. The war had come not just to the military, but to Hawaiian families who had no part in the conflict. By 9:45 a.m., the second wave of Japanese aircraft was withdrawing. Commander Fukuda circled the harbor one last time, photographing the damage and assessing whether to recommend a third wave. The devastation was extraordinary. Battleships sunk or damaged, aircraft destroyed, facilities in flames. But he also noted that the fuel tank farms, which held millions of gallons of oil, remained largely untouched. The repair shops and dry docks were damaged but operational. And crucially, the 3 American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were not in port. At 10 a.m., the last Japanese aircraft departed Oahu airspace, leaving behind an island transformed into hell. As the drone of aircraft engines faded, an eerie quiet descended over Pearl Harbor, broken only by the crackle of flames, the groans of damaged ships, and the screams of wounded men. The harbor water burned with oil fires. Black smoke rose thousands of feet into the once pristine Hawaiian sky. And everywhere, on ships, in the water, along the shore, lay the bodies of young Americans who had woken that morning expecting an ordinary Sunday. The rescue efforts began immediately. Sailors who had been thrown into the water climbed back aboard damaged ships and began pulling their shipmates from the flames and water. Small boats crisscrossed the harbor, their crews fishing out survivors and recovering the dead. The oil fires made this work nightmarishly difficult. Rescuers had to navigate through walls of flame, often diving beneath the surface to reach trapped men. The USS Oklahoma presented a unique horror. From inside her capsized hull came the steady sound of men banging on metal, 43 sailors were trapped in air pockets inside the overturned battleship. Cutting crews worked frantically through the day and night, using acetylene torches to cut through the thick steel plates. They saved 32 men, but 11 died before they could be reached. Some of those rescued had been trapped in complete darkness in air pockets barely large enough to crouch in. Listen to the water slowly rising, wondering if rescue would come before the air ran out or the water reached them. Julio de Castro, a civilian yard worker, led one of the cutting crews. For 18 hours straight, he and his team cut hole after hole in the Oklahoma's hull, guided by the frantic banging from inside. Each time they broke through, desperate, oil-covered men would squeeze through the narrow openings. De Castro would later recall the haunting sound of the banging, and how it gradually became weaker as trapped men succumbed to their injuries or ran out of air. At the hospital facilities across Oahu, medical personnel faced an overwhelming crisis. Tripler Army Hospital, designed for 500 patients, received over 700 wounded within the first 3 hours. The Naval Hospital at Pearl Harbor was similarly overwhelmed. Doctors, nurses, and corpsmen worked with assembly line efficiency, performing emergency surgeries, treating burns, setting broken bones, and making the agonizing decisions about who could be saved and who was beyond help. Nurse Ruth Erickson was on duty at the Naval Hospital when the attack began. She later described the scene. The burned men came streaming into the hospital. The smell of burned flesh was nauseating. We worked around the clock. The doctors would perform surgery, and we'd get them stabilized, but they kept coming. So many young boys, barely 18 or 19 years old, burned beyond recognition. The morgues filled quickly, forcing the establishment of temporary facilities. Bodies were laid out in rows, covered with sheets. The grim work of identification began, dog tags when available, dental records, or personal effects. Some bodies were so badly burned or damaged that identification would take days or weeks. Some would never be identified at all. In Washington, D.C., 5,000 miles away, the first confused reports had begun arriving at the Navy Department around 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 8 a.m. Hawaiian Time. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox initially didn't believe the reports, thinking they must be referring to a drill or exercise. As more details arrived, the magnitude of the disaster became clear. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was in the Oval Office when he received the news. His first reaction was one of shock, then anger, then steely determination. He immediately began calling his military advisors and cabinet members. Secretary of State Cordell Hull was meeting with Japanese Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura and Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu at the State Department at the exact moment bombs were falling on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese diplomats were delivering what was supposed to be Japan's official breaking of diplomatic relations. But the attack had begun before they could deliver the message, making it a surprise attack not just tactically but diplomatically. Hull, who had been a courteous diplomat for decades, barely contained his fury. After reading the Japanese message, he told them, "In all my 50 years of public service, I have never seen a document that was more crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions. Infamous falsehoods and distortions on a scale so huge that I never imagined until today that any government on this planet was capable of uttering them." Back in Hawaii, as afternoon turned to evening, fear gripped the island. Would the Japanese return? Would there be an invasion? Air raid sirens sounded repeatedly throughout the day, some genuine alerts, others false alarms triggered by jittery observers. Anti-aircraft guns fired at clouds, birds, and American aircraft trying to land. Blackout conditions were imposed as darkness fell. Honolulu, usually lit up at night, went completely dark. At Pearl Harbor, the work continued under spotlights and emergency lighting. Fires still burned on several ships. The rescue of trapped men from the Oklahoma continued. Salvage crews began the difficult assessment of which ships might be saved and which were total losses. Divers went down into the murky, oil-filled water to inspect damage below the waterline, a dangerous job made more perilous by the risk of unexploded ordnance and the possibility of another attack. Admiral Husband Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, stood at his window overlooking the harbor, watching his fleet burn. A spent bullet crashed through the window and hit him in the chest, but it had lost enough velocity that it only bruised him. He picked it up and said, "It would have been merciful had it killed me." Kimmel and Army Lieutenant General Walter Short, who commanded the Army forces on Oahu, would both be relieved of their commands within days and would face investigations and recriminations for the rest of their lives over their perceived failure to adequately prepare for the attack. As night fell over Hawaii, America on the mainland was waking up to the news. The attack had begun at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, just as millions of Americans were sitting down to Sunday lunch or listening to the radio. The first bulletins were brief and confusing. Then came more details, each one more shocking than the last. In homes across America, families gathered around their radios. In New York, in small towns in Iowa, in Texas, in California, everywhere Americans listened in stunned disbelief. Japan had attacked American soil. American servicemen had been killed. The United States was at war. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Recruiting offices across the country began receiving phone calls even before they opened Monday morning. Young men lined up around the block, eager to enlist. The isolationist sentiment that had dominated American public opinion for the past 2 years evaporated overnight. The nation that had desperately wanted to stay out of foreign wars now demanded vengeance. In Washington, President Roosevelt worked through the evening, preparing his address to Congress. He conferred with Secretary of State Hull, who wanted the message to include a detailed chronology of Japanese-American relations and demonstrate how Japan had been negotiating in bad faith. But Roosevelt understood the moment required something different, something concise, powerful, and emotional that would rally the American people. Around 8 p.m. Hawaii time, 1 a.m. Eastern, Roosevelt sat down with a pen and paper and began writing. His initial draft began, "Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in world history." He crossed out world history and wrote infamy. With that single word change, he created what would become one of the most famous speeches in American history. At Pearl Harbor, the overnight hours brought new horrors and new heroes. Rescue efforts continued under floodlights, but there were also grim discoveries. As divers explored sunken ships and firefighters entered burned compartments, the true scale of the casualties became apparent. The Arizona alone had lost 1,177 men. The Oklahoma had lost 429. Dozens more had died on other ships, at airfields in Honolulu. The final count wouldn't be completed for days. The hospital wards remained scenes of organized chaos. Nurses moved from bed to bed, checking vitals, changing dressings, offering what comfort they could. Many of the wounded were in shock, unable to comprehend what had happened. Some called out for their mothers. Others asked about their shipmates, not knowing if their friends had survived. Some would die during the night, despite the best efforts of medical personnel. Father Aloysius Schmidt, a Catholic chaplain aboard the USS Oklahoma, had helped several sailors escape from the capsized ship before the rising water made escape impossible. Witnesses reported that when only one more man could fit through an escape porthole, Father Schmidt, though he could have gone himself, pushed another sailor through instead, sacrificing his own life. He became the first American chaplain to die in World War II, and he would not be the last. Across Oahu, soldiers and sailors stood guard through the night, scanning the darkness for signs of a Japanese invasion that many believed was imminent. Machine gun nests were set up on beaches. Artillery pieces were positioned to defend against amphibious assault. Civilian defense volunteers patrolled neighborhoods. Everyone was on edge, jumping at every sound, ready to fight for their homes and their families. The Japanese task force, meanwhile, was steaming northwest at high speed, heading back toward Japan. Aboard the carriers, pilots who had participated in the attack were celebrating their success, but also feeling the weight of what they had begun. Commander Fukuda recommended against a third wave, believing they had achieved sufficient damage and that American defenses would be better prepared for another attack. Admiral Chuchi Nagumo agreed. The carriers turned for home, leaving destruction in their wake. The sun rose on December 8th over a changed Hawaii and a changed America. The tropical paradise was now an armed camp. The isolationist nation was now committed to war, and the lives of millions of Americans and billions of people around the world had been irrevocably altered. At 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, President Roosevelt arrived at the Capitol to address a joint session of Congress. Every seat in the chamber was filled. The galleries were packed. Millions more listened on radio across the nation and around the world. Roosevelt, wearing a black armband and leaning heavily on the arm of his son James, made his way to the podium. His speech lasted only 6.5 minutes, just 501 words. But each word had been carefully chosen for maximum impact. He began with the phrase that would echo through history. Yesterday, December 7, 1941. A date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. He detailed the attacks not just on Pearl Harbor, but on Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippines, Wake Island, and Midway Island, a coordinated offensive across the Pacific. He spoke of the betrayal, noting that the attack came while Japanese diplomats were still negotiating in Washington, and he called for action. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God. He asked Congress to declare that a state of war existed between the United States and Japan. The vote was nearly unanimous. 82-0 in the Senate, 388-1 in the House. The lone dissenter was Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, a pacifist who had also voted against entering World War I. She would not be re-elected. America was at war. In Hawaii, the grim work of recovery continued. The first priority was making the harbor functional again. The Nevada, though badly damaged, could be refloated. The California and West Virginia had settled into the mud upright. They too could potentially be raised. The Oklahoma was capsized and would require a massive effort to right. The Arizona was a total loss, though eventually she would become a memorial, her sunken hull a tomb for the men still inside. The story of the next 24 hours after the attack was one of resilience, determination, and transformation. Civilian workers at the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard worked around the clock to begin repairs. The undamaged dry docks began receiving ships for emergency repairs. The fuel tanks, miraculously untouched during the attack, continued supplying oil to vessels. The submarine base was operational, and American submarines would begin deploying on war patrols within days. The psychological impact on the survivors would last for decades. Seaman James Corey, who had survived the Arizona's destruction, spent 3 days in the hospital being treated for burns and injuries. He would return to duty aboard another ship and serve throughout the war, but he would have nightmares about the explosion for the rest of his life. He died in 2002 at age 80, and his ashes were interred aboard the Arizona with his shipmates who had died that day. Doris Miller, the mess attendant who had manned an anti-aircraft gun and helped save wounded sailors, became a national hero. He went on speaking tours, selling war bonds, and encouraging African Americans to join the military. He was killed in action on November 24, 1943, when the escort carrier USS Liscum Bay was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. The Navy named a frigate after him in 1973, and in 2020, a new aircraft carrier was named USS Doris Miller, the first American aircraft carrier named for an African American. The attack on Pearl Harbor killed 2,403 Americans and wounded 1,178 more. 18 ships were sunk or damaged. Nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed. The damage was devastating, but not as complete as the Japanese had hoped. The carriers had not been destroyed. The repair facilities remained functional. The fuel supplies were intact. And most importantly, the American spirit had not been broken. It had been ignited. In the days, weeks, and months after Pearl Harbor, America transformed itself. Factories that had been producing consumer goods retooled to build tanks, aircraft, and ships. Women entered the workforce by the millions. Rationing was implemented. Liberty was curtailed as Japanese Americans were unjustly interned. The entire economy and society oriented itself toward one goal: winning the war. Pearl Harbor had indeed been a day of infamy, but it had also been a day of transformation. The The surprise attack that was meant to cripple American military power instead awakened a sleeping giant. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had planned the attack, reportedly said afterward, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Whether he actually said these exact words is disputed, but the sentiment was accurate. The survivors of Pearl Harbor carried both physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives. But they also carried pride. Pride in having survived, pride in having served, pride in having witnessed the beginning of America's participation in the war that would define the 20th century. They had been present at the moment when America entered hell, and they had lived to tell about it. The USS Arizona Memorial, built over the sunken hull of the battleship in 1962, receives nearly 2 million visitors each year. They come to remember the 1,177 men still entombed below, to honor the sacrifice of all who died that day, and to reflect on how December 7, 1941, changed the world forever. Oil still seeps from the Arizona's fuel tanks, rising to the surface in rainbow-colored droplets that the Park Service staff call the tears of the Arizona. Every December 7th at 7:55 a.m. Hawaii time, a memorial ceremony is held at Pearl Harbor. A Navy band plays the national anthem. Survivors, now few in number, sit in places of honor. Ships in the harbor sound their horns. Fighter jets fly overhead in missing man formation. And Americans remember the day their nation entered hell and emerged forged into the arsenal of democracy that would help save the world from tyranny. The first 24 hours after Pearl Harbor were hours of death, destruction, heroism, and transformation. They were hours that demonstrated the worst and best of humanity, the capacity for surprise and violence, but also for courage, sacrifice, and resilience. They were the hours when America went from peacetime complacency to wartime determination, from isolationism to global engagement, from sleep to wakefulness. Pearl Harbor was hell, but from that hell emerged the American century. The men and women who lived through that day, who fought the fires, who pulled the wounded from the water, who counted the dead, who vowed never to forget. They ensured that December 7, 1941, would indeed be a date that would live in infamy. But they also ensured it would be remembered not just as a day of defeat, but as the beginning of eventual victory. The first 24 hours after Pearl Harbor set America on a path from which there was no return. The world would never be the same. America would never be the same. And the men and women who experienced those hours would carry their memories forever. Memories of the day paradise became hell, and an entire nation transformed in fire and blood into the force that would help liberate a world at war.